Опа. Итак, всем привет, с вами передача Пилот 0+. И сегодня мы уже точно должны пролететь и приземлиться на нашем авиасимуляторе. Так, надо сесть поудобнее. Мгм. Tutorial Flying in Pattern. Старт. Я уже забыл, что там нам надо было сделать. Ну-ка, давайте еще раз. Надо пролететь в направлении 220 градусов, подняться до 100 фунтов. Та-та-та-та. Потом 500 фунтов. Еще что-то. Crosswind, downwind, base. Сто фунтов на скорость 90 километров. Вот еще один. Нифига себе.
Welcome aboard. Need help? Use help tutorials.
Снимаем тормоза.
Release the parking brakes, smoothly apply full power and start your takeoff.
Гадина!
Apply full throttle for takeoff.
Ладно, мы как настоящие пилоты.
Release the parking brake using Shift B.
Третий прайм.
Apply full throttle for takeoff.
Разгоняемся.
Stay on the center line of the runway using the rudder. Take off at 65 knots and climb straight out on heading 220 at 600 feet per minute about
65.
17 knots. Continue your climb on heading 220 at 600 feet per minute to 1000 feet. You are heading too far left, turn right slightly to heading 220. Your climb angle is too great, lower the nose slightly to decrease your climb rate. You are heading too far left, turn right slightly to heading 220.
Нам нужно 220.
Continue your climb on heading 220 at 600 feet per minute to 1000 feet. Your climb angle is too great, lower the nose slightly to decrease your climb rate. You are heading too far left, turn right slightly to heading 220. Continue your climb on heading 220 at 600 feet per minute to 1000 feet. Your climb angle is too great, lower the nose slightly to decrease your climb rate. Continue your climb on heading 220 at 600 feet per minute to 1000 feet. Your climb angle is too shallow, raise the nose slightly to increase your climb rate. Make a right turn to crosswind heading 310, and continue climbing to 1500 feet. You are too far left, turn right to heading 310.
Так, выше.
Make a right turn to crosswind heading 310 and continue climbing to 1500 feet. You're too far left, turn right to heading 310. Make a right turn to crosswind heading 310 and continue climbing to 1500 feet. Level off the aircraft at 1500 ft and maintain heading and altitude for a few more seconds.
Так.
Now make another 90-degree right turn to downwind heading 40. You're too far right, turn left to heading 40.
Да, я понял.
You're too far left, turn right to heading 40.
Так,
Reduce
40.
power to 80 to 85%, entering for level flight, continue flying parallel to the runway. You are heading too far right, turn left slightly to heading 40.
Улетел далеко слишком, блин. Прикольно, мы летим параллельно к нему, оказывается. Вот куда мы летим. Мы летим сюда.
You are too high, pattern altitude is 1500 feet. You are heading too far right, turn left slightly to heading 40. You are heading too far left, turn right slightly to heading 40. Reduce power to 80 to 85%, entering for level flight, continue flying parallel to the runway. Reduce power to 80 to 85%, entering for level flight, continue flying parallel to the runway. Reduce power to 80 to 85%, entering for level flight, continue flying parallel to the runway. You are heading too far left, turn right slightly to heading 40.
Давай, с ракет.
Reduce power to 80 to 85%, entering for level flight, continue flying parallel to the runway. You are too high, pattern altitude is 1500 feet.
Снижаемся.
You are now opposite the end of the runway, reduce power to 70%, set flaps to 10.
70. 10. Спускаемся.
Let the aircraft descend and slow down, continue flying heading of 40. You are too high, you should be descending to around 1,300 feet.
Так, до 1300 должны спуститься. Тысяча триста.
Turn left to base heading 130, and set flaps to 20, continue descending, but make sure to maintain a safe altitude above the ground. Turn on to final heading 220, and line up with the runway. Turn on to final heading 220, and line up with the runway.
Поворачиваемся. Что такое? Не в ту сторону.
Turn on to final heading
Поворачивай, эй.
220, and line up with the runway.
Мы теряем высоту. Стой.
Turn on to final heading 220, and line up with the runway. Turn on to final heading 220, and line up with the runway. Turn on to final heading 220 and line up
О,
with the
стой, стой,
runway.
стой, стой! Собака!
Turn on to final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Да почему перевернула? Аккуратно, взлетаем, 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 взлетаем. Мы
Turn
можем
on to
взлететь.
final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Заткнись, я хочу не упасть. Блин! 200 и 100 фунтов. 0 фунтов. А,
Turn on to final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
так, пусть погрузится. Теперь полетели.
Release the parking brakes, smoothly apply full power and start your takeoff. Apply full throttle for takeoff.
Мгм.
Stay on the center line of the runway using the rudder. Take off at 65 knots and climb straight out on heading 220 at 600 feet per minute, about 17 knots. Continue your climb on heading 220 at 600 feet per minute to 1000 feet. Your climb angle is too great, lower the nose slightly to decrease your climb rate. You are heading too far left, turn right slightly to heading 220. Continue your climb on heading 220 at 600 feet per minute to 1000 feet. Your climb angle is too great, lower the nose slightly to decrease your climb rate. You are heading too far right, turn left slightly to heading 220. Your climb angle is too great, lower the nose slightly to decrease your climb rate. Continue your climb on heading 220 at 600 feet per minute to 1000 feet. Your climb angle is too great, lower the nose slightly to decrease your climb rate. You are heading too far right, turn left slightly to heading 220. Your climb angle is too great, lower the nose slightly to decrease your climb rate. You are heading too far right, turn left slightly to heading 220. Make a right turn to crosswind heading 310, and continue climbing to 1500 feet. You're too far left, turn right to heading 310.
Так, легкий поворот. Ух ты.
Level off the aircraft at 1500 ft and maintain heading and altitude for a few more seconds. Now make another 90-degree right turn to downwind heading 40. You're getting too high, descend to 1500 ft. Too far left, turn right to heading 40. You're getting too high, descend to 1500 ft.
Спускаемся. Давай, давай, давай. 10 фунтов в секунду. Vertical speed.
too far right, turn left to heading 40.
Так, level off.
You're getting too high, descend to 1500 ft. You're too far right, turn left to heading 40. Reduce power to 80 to 85%, entering for level flight, continue flying parallel to the runway. You are now opposite the end of the runway, reduce power to 70%, set flaps to 10. You are now opposite the end of the runway, reduce power to 70%, set flaps to 10.
Блин, да что такое, он не показывает мне.
You are now opposite the end of the runway, reduce power to 70%, set flaps to 10. Let the aircraft descend and slow down, continue flying heading of 40. You are too high, you should be descending to around 1,300 feet. You are heading too far right, turn left slightly to heading 40. You are heading too far left, turn right slightly to heading 40. You are too high, you should be descending to around 1,300 feet.
Так. Спускаться надо.
You are heading too far right, turn left slightly to heading 40. You are too high, you should be descending to around 1,300 feet.
Так. Мы здесь. Нет, мы еще не здесь.
Turn left to base heading 130, and set flaps to 20. Continue descending, but make sure to maintain a safe altitude above the ground. Turn on to final heading 220, and line up with the runway. Turn on to final heading 220, and line up with the runway.
Да-да, поворачивай, жди.
Turn on to final heading 220, and line up with the runway. Turn on to final heading 220, and line up with the runway. Turn on to final heading 220, and line up with the runway. Turn on to final heading 220, and line up with the runway.
Мне нужно высоту набрать немножко.
Turn on to final heading 220, and line up with the runway. Turn on to final heading 220, and line up with the runway.
Стой.
Turn on to final heading 220, and line up with the runway. Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Я не вижу его. А, мы теряем высоту еще вдобавок.
Turn onto final heading 220 and line
Картана.
up with the runway.
Прекрати визжать, я и так лечу, куда ты направляешь.
Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway. Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Так, с какой стороны этот runway? Я его не вижу на карте. Сейчас давайте смухлюем. Опля! Так, если предположить, что мы прилетели оттуда, то runway будет вон там.
Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Ай. Главное не потерять высоту, а то
Turn
сейчас мы
onto final
грохнемся
heading
опять.
220 and line up with the runway.
Мы летим, Картана, мы летим. Мы просто не знаем, где твой runway, любимый.
Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway. Turn onto final heading 220 and
Что
line
такое?
up with
Почему-то
the
нас
runway.
уносит вправо.
Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway. Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Не-не-не, стой, 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 стой. Потихоньку, потихоньку. Короче, поднимаемся обратно. Задолбала эта Картана.
Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Почему мы теряем высоту?
Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway. Turn onto final heading 220 and line up
Подожди,
with the
Картана, мы
runway.
тут опять тонем с тобой. Короче, к черту ее, сейчас поднимемся сначала, нам надо вернуть высоту себе.
Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway. Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway. Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway. Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway. Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Да и лечу, я туда к этому. Почему что за летел запарил меня?
Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway. Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway. Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Кажется, я его вижу.
Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway. Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway. Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Так где он?
Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Я лечу на 220, я не вижу твоего runway, дуёха ты.
Turn onto
Картана.
final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Где он? Так, вот это вид со стороны runway. То есть море, второй берег. А вот он. И нам туда. Вон он. Картана дура. Так. Нам тут
Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Тут сейчас
Turn
поворачивать
onto final
направо.
heading 220 and line up with the
Ай-яй-яй.
runway.
Вон он runway, короче, нам опять придется сейчас повернуть туда.
Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Так, берем высоту 1300 и летим, короче, к runway налево.
Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Вон он справа, да. Сейчас держим высоту 1300. Летим, чтобы с ним сравняться.
Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Так, надо поднабрать высоту
Turn onto
1400.
final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Эй, стой, ты чё? Флаг. Поднимаем первые флапсы и
Turn onto
поворачиваем
final
направо.
heading 220 and line up with the runway. Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway.
Да, сейчас я, подожди, поворачиваю. Не торопи меня, картана. Я так за тебя запутался.
Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the
Ты чё?
runway.
Самолетик. Тихо. Я помню, что у нас может быть bank angle.
Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the
Черную. Ой,
runway.
блин, мы далеко, ну ладно. Может, достаточно. Так, стоп. Еще чуть-чуть направо.
Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway. Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway. Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway. Turn onto final heading 220 and line up with the runway. Set flaps to 30, control your descent rate using the throttle. Set flaps to 30, control your descent rate using the throttle. Set flaps to 30, control your descent rate using the throttle. Set flaps to 30, control your descent rate using the throttle. Slowly reduce power to idle, and you are about 10 feet above the ground. Smoothly bring the nose up so it is just above the horizon. Slowly reduce power to idle, and you are about 10 feet above the ground. Smoothly bring the nose up so it is just above the horizon. Slowly reduce power to idle, and you are about 10 feet above the ground. Smoothly bring the nose up so it is just above the horizon. Keep tracking straight down the runway using the rudder and let the aircraft land on the main gear. Lower the nose wheel, continue to track down the runway and gently brake to a stop. Lower the nose wheel, continue to track down the runway and gently brake to a stop. Lower the nose wheel, continue to track down the runway and gently brake to a stop. Congratulations on successfully following the pattern. If you want to practice more landings, you can take off again immediately. Don't forget to lift your flaps though. This is known as a touch and go.
В этот раз прокатило. Как далеко мы улетели. Ох, ё-моё, там даже не видно этого ранавея. Где ты там, ранавей? Где он? Вау. Это мы что, получается, прям по домам пролетели? Точно, здесь дома, оказывается. Да, вот чего не симулировали здесь корректно. Это домов. Иначе бы точно разбили самолет. Но засчитала. Смухлюем в этот раз. Всем пока.